The sun was setting behind the tall trees, casting long shadows across the old house. It was a quiet evening, but inside, the air was heavy with sadness. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now felt cold and empty. Emily, a young girl of only 9, sat by the window, looking out at the fading light. She didn't really understand what was happening, but she knew something important was going on. It was her grandmother's funeral. Emily had always loved her grandmother. The old woman had been kind, always telling her stories and giving her sweet treats when her parents weren't looking. But today, everything felt different. Emily didn't feel like playing or running around like she usually did. She felt as though something was missing, like the world had changed forever. The living room was filled with relatives, some crying, others speaking in low voices. Emily's father, David, was busy talking to the funeral director. He had always been a man of few words, but today his face was tight with worry, and his eyes were red from crying. It hurt Emily to see her dad like this. She had never seen him so sad. David's sister, Aunt Claire, walked by and gently placed her hand on Emily's shoulder. "Are you okay, sweetie?" she asked softly. Emily nodded, but she didn't feel okay. The house felt too quiet, and the walls seemed to be closing in on her. The funeral was set for the next day, and everyone was preparing for it. The house had been decorated with flowers, white roses and lilies that filled the rooms with a soft, sweet scent. Emily didn't like flowers much. They made her think of sadness and loss. But her father insisted on making everything perfect. He wanted the funeral to be a peaceful goodbye, a way to honor the memory of his mother. As Emily sat there, watching the adults talk in the other room, her mind wandered. She didn't fully understand why they were all so upset. Grandma had always seemed so strong to her. She couldn't believe she was gone. The thought made her heart ache. She missed her, and yet something didn't feel right. Emily looked around the room. It was strange seeing everything so serious. Normally, her family would be laughing, talking, and making jokes. But today, there was a heavy silence, and it was hard for Emily to breathe in the quiet. She had never seen her father so still, his usually bright and caring eyes now filled with sorrow. Her father, the man who had always protected her, was now struggling to hold it all together. It made Emily feel small and helpless. In the midst of it all, something inside her stirred. Emily didn't know what it was, but she had a feeling that something was about to happen. She couldn't explain it, but she could feel it deep inside. Something that had been hidden for a long time was about to come out, something no one was ready to face. But for now, Emily stayed quiet, watching as her father spoke to the people around him. She couldn't help but wonder, what had her grandmother really been like? What secrets had she kept hidden from everyone? Little did she know, the answers to these questions were closer than she thought. The day of the funeral had arrived, and the house was filled with people dressed in dark clothes. Emily sat quietly in the corner of the living room, looking around at the grown-ups. The atmosphere was different from the family gatherings she was used to. There were no games, no laughter, only hushed voices and sad faces. Emily's father, David, was at the center of everything. He stood by the front door, shaking hands with guests and nodding politely, but his eyes looked tired and distant. Emily watched him closely. She had never seen him like this before. Usually, he was strong, always telling jokes or helping with whatever needed to be done. But today, he seemed lost. Aunt Claire, David's sister, was talking softly to a few relatives in the kitchen. Her face was pale, and her eyes were swollen from crying. Emily had always thought of Aunt Claire as a funny and warm woman, but today, she was different. There was a sadness in her eyes that Emily couldn't explain. The house felt colder than usual, despite the warm sun outside. It was almost as if the walls themselves were mourning the loss of Emily's grandmother. Everywhere she looked, people were either talking in whispers or sitting quietly, trying to hold back their tears. Emily felt like an outsider in her own home. The adults were all caught up in their own grief, and no one seemed to notice how she was feeling. But Emily wasn't just sad. She was confused. She couldn't understand why everyone was acting so differently. Grandma had always seemed so strong and full of life. How could she be gone? Emily missed the way Grandma would smile at her, the way she would tell stories, and the way she made everything feel safe. But something else was bothering Emily, something that made her heart race and her mind wander. As the afternoon passed, the guests continued to arrive. Some were family, others were close friends of Grandma. Emily overheard bits and pieces of conversations. People spoke of the good times they had shared with Grandma, and some even talked about her kindness and generosity. But there were other whispers too, ones that Emily couldn't quite make out. She tried to listen closer, but the voices would always fade before she could understand. David seemed more distant as the day went on. He would smile when someone spoke to him, but his smile never reached his eyes. He kept glancing at the door, as though he was waiting for something or someone. Emily noticed that her father's hands trembled slightly whenever he held a glass or greeted a guest. She wondered if it was because he was sad or if it was something else. The funeral itself was quiet, somber, and full of rituals that Emily didn't fully understand. She sat beside her father, watching as the casket was lowered into the ground. The sky had turned gray, and a gentle breeze blew through the trees, carrying with it a sense of finality. Emily's heart felt heavy, but still, she couldn't shake the strange feeling that something important was hidden beneath all the sadness. Her father had always been so open with her, but today, he seemed distant and unreachable. Emily wanted to ask him what was going on, but she didn't know how. The only thing she knew for sure was that something wasn't right, and she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in her chest. As the funeral came to a close, David turned to Emily and placed his hand on her shoulder. His touch was gentle, but there was a sadness in his eyes that made Emily's heart ache. She wanted to ask him so many things, but she knew he wasn't ready to talk. Not yet. But Emily was determined to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. She could feel that something was about to change, and she couldn't let it go. The days after the funeral were filled with silence. The house, once busy with family and friends, now felt empty and still. Emily's father, David, had returned to his usual routines, but he was not the same. He seemed quieter, more withdrawn. Emily noticed the little things, the way his eyes would linger on old family photos, or how he would sigh deeply when he thought no one was looking. She could tell he was struggling, but no one seemed to want to talk about it. Emily, however, couldn't stop thinking about what had happened at the funeral. She had always trusted her grandmother's stories, but now she couldn't help but wonder, were those stories the truth? Emily had heard people whispering in hushed voices, saying strange things about her grandmother. They never mentioned it directly, but there was something in their words that made Emily feel uncomfortable. One evening, as Emily was sitting in the living room, her cousin Lily came over to visit. Lily was only a little older than Emily, and the two had always been close. They often played together and shared secrets. But tonight felt different. Emily didn't know why, but she felt like she had to tell Lily something important. "Lily, do you ever wonder about Grandma?" Emily asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Lily looked up from the book she was reading. "What do you mean?" she replied, not really understanding what Emily was asking. "Do you ever wonder if Grandma really told us everything?" Emily pressed, her brow furrowing. "Like, what if there's something we don't know? Something bad?" Lily paused for a moment, staring at Emily with wide eyes. "What are you talking about?" Emily hesitated but then spoke, her voice trembling slightly. "I overheard some people at the funeral. They were talking about Grandma, about things she did, things she never told anyone." Lily's eyes grew even wider. "What did they say?" she asked, her voice suddenly serious. Emily leaned in closer, making sure no one else could hear. "I think Grandma might have done something terrible. I'm not sure what, but I know it's something big, something that would make Dad sadder than just losing her." Lily was silent for a moment, processing what Emily had said. Finally, she spoke, her voice a bit shaky. "Do you think it's true that Grandma did something bad?" Emily nodded, though she didn't feel entirely sure herself. "I don't know, but I have this feeling. It's like a secret that everyone is hiding." Lily was quiet for a long time, and Emily could tell she was thinking deeply. "What should we do about it?" Lily finally asked. "I don't know," Emily admitted, "but I think we need to find out what really happened. Grandma might have kept something hidden from everyone, and I don't think we can let it go." The two girls sat there for a while, the weight of their conversation hanging in the air. Emily knew she had opened a door that couldn't easily be closed. She wasn't sure what they would find, but she knew one thing for certain. Her grandmother's life wasn't as simple as everyone had made it seem. There were secrets buried deep, and Emily was determined to uncover them, no matter what it took. That night, as Emily lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. The truth, whatever it was closer than ever. She just had to find it. The next day, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She hadn't told her father what she and Lily had discussed the night before, but the conversation kept replaying in her mind. What if Grandma had really done something terrible? What if no one knew the truth? Emily couldn't just let it go. She had to find out more. That afternoon, the family gathered for a small memorial service in the garden. It wasn't as big as the funeral, but it was still a way for everyone to remember Grandma. The weather was warm, and the birds were chirping, but the air still felt heavy with grief. Emily could hear the soft murmurs of the family as they talked to each other, but she was lost in her thoughts. She wanted to ask her father about what she had heard, but she didn't know how. He had been so quiet since the funeral, and she didn't want to upset him even more. As the day went on, Emily grew more and more restless. She couldn't help herself. She needed answers. Without thinking much more, she walked over to the center of the gathering, where her father was standing, talking to some of his cousins. They were all lost in conversation, and no one noticed Emily standing there. Taking a deep breath, Emily walked up to her father and tugged at his sleeve. He looked down at her, a little surprised by the interruption, but smiled gently. "What is it, sweetheart?" Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with determination. "I need to say something, Dad. It's important." David's smile faded slightly. "What is it, Emily? What's on your mind?" Emily hesitated. She had thought about this moment over and over in her head, but now that it was happening, she wasn't sure if she was ready. But the words slipped out before she could stop them. "Grandma killed someone." There was a stunned silence. Everyone in the small group turned to look at Emily, their faces confused and alarmed. Emily's father's expression quickly changed from surprise to concern. He knelt down so he could be eye level with her. "Emily, what are you talking about?" he asked softly, his voice shaky. "That's not true. Your grandmother would never do something like that." But Emily was sure of herself. She had never been this certain of anything in her life. "I heard people talking at the funeral. They said Grandma did something bad. I think she was hiding something. She might have hurt someone." David's face grew pale, and for a moment, he seemed to freeze. Emily could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his hands trembled. She hadn't expected this reaction. She thought her father would just tell her she was imagining things, but instead, his expression was filled with something else, something that scared Emily. "Emily, stop talking like this," David said, his voice much firmer now, but with a slight tremor that Emily couldn't ignore. "Your grandmother was a good woman. She loved you. She didn't hurt anyone. But why were people saying things?" Emily pressed, her voice rising. "I need to know the truth, Dad. I can feel it. There's something wrong." David's face hardened, and he stood up quickly, his hand gripping his daughter's shoulder. "Enough," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "We don't talk about this anymore." The crowd around them fell silent, and Emily could feel their eyes on her. She felt embarrassed, but her curiosity and need for answers were stronger than her fear. Emily didn't understand why her father was so upset. Didn't he want to know the truth too? She just wanted to understand what had happened to her grandmother. Why was it so hard to talk about? Her father didn't answer her question. Instead, he looked around at the family, who were all watching with worried expressions. His jaw tightened as he turned away, walking toward the house. Emily stood there, feeling more confused than ever. She had spoken up because she thought her father would want to know the truth, but now she wasn't so sure. Something was wrong, and it seemed like no one, not even her father, wanted to face it. But Emily knew she couldn't ignore what she had heard. The truth was out there, and she was determined to find it, no matter what. The atmosphere in the house became even heavier after Emily's shocking outburst. Everyone had gone quiet after her bold accusation about her grandmother. David, her father, was visibly shaken, and it was clear that the tension had built up among the family. No one knew quite what to say. The whispers of Emily's words had reached everyone, and many of them were looking at each other with confused, concerned expressions. David quickly took Emily by the hand and walked her away from the group, his grip tight, his face pale. He didn't say a word as he led her into the quiet of the living room. Emily felt a lump form in her throat, unsure if she had done something wrong. She just wanted answers, but now her father was acting strangely. It was like he was hiding something. "Dad?" Emily asked, her voice small and unsure. David turned to face her, his face softening for a moment. "Emily, I need you to understand something. Your grandmother, she loved you. She wouldn't have done anything like what you said. But why were people talking about it?" Emily pressed, her eyes wide with confusion. "I heard them at the funeral. They said Grandma kept a secret. She hid something. Please, I need to know what it is." David sighed deeply, running his fingers through his hair, clearly distressed. "Sometimes people talk about things they don't fully understand, Emily. Grandma's life wasn't always easy, but she was a good person. You have to trust me on that." But Emily didn't feel like she could trust him. If Grandma had been so good, why was everyone acting so strange? Why were the whispers still lingering in the air? She knew something wasn't right. David's voice grew quieter, but more urgent. "I don't want you to think that way about your grandmother. She did the best she could for all of us. I don't want you to start imagining things." Emily felt a knot in her stomach. "But I'm not imagining it. I heard what they said. I heard them talk about the bad things. Why can't you tell me the truth, Dad? Why are you acting like it didn't happen?" David seemed to struggle with his words, his face growing darker. "Some things are better left in the past, Emily. There are things I don't want you to know. Not yet." Emily felt her frustration rise. She had always thought that her father would tell her everything. She had always believed that there was nothing he wouldn't share with her. But now, it felt like he was keeping something important from her. The more he tried to push her questions away, the more Emily felt certain that her grandmother's secret was real. And it was bigger than anything she had imagined. As the hours passed, the family gathered around the dining table for a meal, but the mood had shifted. People spoke in hushed voices, occasionally glancing at Emily and her father, but no one dared to bring up the topic again. Emily couldn't help but overhear bits of their conversations. They spoke of her grandmother's kindness and the good she had done for others. But there was an underlying unease, as if they were all trying to ignore something. It felt like everyone knew something that she didn't. Some of the relatives seemed to be avoiding eye contact with David, and a few even whispered to one another when they thought he wasn't listening. Emily noticed how uncomfortable her father looked, shifting in his seat and tapping his fingers nervously on the table. The more she observed, the more she realized that no one was truly at peace, not even with themselves. When the meal was over, Emily found herself sitting alone on the stairs, looking out the window at the darkening sky. She didn't know what had happened, but the more she thought about it, the more she felt something important was just beyond her reach. She knew her family was hiding something, and it wasn't just about her grandmother. They were all tied to the secret in some way. The question was, what were they so afraid of? Emily didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was clear: her search for the truth had only just begun. And no matter how hard it was, she wouldn't stop until she uncovered what had been buried for so long. The days that followed were filled with tension. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, and the more her father avoided her questions, the more she became determined to find the answers on her own. She had to know what her grandmother had been hiding, and why everyone was so afraid to talk about it. The secret felt like a heavy weight pressing down on the entire family. One evening after dinner, Emily decided she couldn't wait any longer. She needed to find something, anything, that could help her understand the truth. She had an idea. She remembered that her grandmother had always kept things in a small wooden box hidden under the floorboards in the old family home. Emily wasn't sure exactly what was inside the box, but Grandma had always been so secretive about it. Emily had never been allowed to touch it, but now she felt she had no choice. That night, after her father went to bed, Emily quietly slipped out of her room and into the hallway. The house was dark and silent, but she moved with purpose. She had seen her father store the key to the old family home in a drawer near the kitchen, and tonight she took it without hesitation. She had to know the truth, even if it meant breaking the rules. Emily's heart raced as she reached the family house. The front door creaked open as she pushed it, and the scent of dust and old wood filled her nostrils. The house felt cold and forgotten, but there was something comforting about it too. It was still home, in a way. She made her way upstairs, past the rooms where her parents had once slept, and to the attic door. The old wooden stairs groaned beneath her feet as she climbed up. Once in the attic, Emily's eyes searched the dark corners of the room, where boxes and old furniture were piled high. She knew exactly where to look: the small wooden box hidden beneath the floorboards. She had seen Grandma kneel down and pull it out whenever she needed something important. It was a strange box, weathered by time but still strong. Emily's fingers trembled as she pried the floorboards loose. The box was just where she had remembered. She pulled it out carefully and opened it. Inside, there were old letters, photographs, and a few other items that looked like they had been forgotten for years. Emily's eyes widened as she picked up a bundle of yellowed letters tied together with a piece of string. These were Grandma's letters, written to someone named Edward. Emily's curiosity grew as she began to sift through the letters. The words inside were written in a neat hand, but the tone was dark and filled with regret. There were references to things Emily didn't understand, disagreements, fears, and a sense of guilt that seemed to hang over every page. She could feel the weight of the words, even though she didn't fully understand their meaning. She continued to look through the box, and then she found something even more shocking: an old photograph. It was of her grandmother, but in the background, Emily could see a man she didn't recognize. The man's face was hard to make out, but there was something in his expression that made Emily feel uneasy. He looked angry, almost as if he were hiding something. Emily's heart pounded as she stared at the photo. Who was this man? What did Grandma have to do with him? Why had she kept all of this hidden for so many years? Just then, Emily heard footsteps coming from downstairs. Panic struck her as she quickly shoved everything back into the box and placed it under the floorboards again. She had to hurry. She couldn't let anyone know what she had found. Not yet. As she made her way back down the stairs, Emily's mind raced. She had uncovered something important, but it only raised more questions. Who was Edward? What was her grandmother involved in? The answers were still out of reach, but Emily knew one thing for sure: the secret was bigger than she could have ever imagined, and she was determined to uncover every piece of it, no matter what it took. Emily couldn't stop thinking about the letters and the mysterious photographs she had found in her grandmother's box. Her mind raced with questions. Who was Edward, and why had Grandma hidden these things for so long? What had happened between them? The more Emily thought about it, the more she felt like she was on the edge of uncovering something huge. something that would change everything she thought she knew about her grandmother. Over the next few days, Emily carefully went through the letters again, trying to understand their meaning. Each letter was filled with regret and fear. Some of them seemed like apologies, while others hinted at a secret that her grandmother had been hiding for years. Emily couldn't make sense of it all, but she knew she had to find out more. She decided to ask her father about the man in the photograph, the one who seemed to be a part of her grandmother's past. Maybe he would know something, or at least he could give her a hint about what was going on. Emily felt nervous as she approached David that evening. He was sitting at the kitchen table, looking over some old papers, his face tense and tired. "Dad," Emily began, her voice shaking a little. "I need to ask you about someone. Who is Edward?" David's eyes widened slightly, and he looked up at her with a startled expression. Emily noticed that his hands were trembling as he set the papers down. He didn't say anything at first, but the look on his face told her everything. He knew exactly who Edward was. "Where did you hear that name?" David asked, his voice tight. Emily could see the fear in his eyes. "I found some letters, and there was a photograph," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's from Grandma's things. She kept them hidden." But who was Edward? What did he mean to Grandma? David's face drained of color, and he stood up quickly, walking away from the table. Emily watched as he paced back and forth, his breathing quickening. She had never seen him like this before. Her father was always so calm and in control, but now he seemed like he was about to lose it. "Dad, please," Emily pleaded. "I need to know. What happened?" David stopped pacing and turned to face her. His face was grim, and his voice was low. "Edward was someone your grandmother knew when she was young. They were close, very close, but something went wrong. Something I never wanted you to know about." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. "What do you mean? What happened to Edward?" David hesitated for a long moment before speaking again. "It's a story from a long time ago, one that your grandmother never wanted anyone to remember. She made mistakes, terrible mistakes, and she tried to bury them all. She thought that if no one knew the truth, they could all move on with their lives." Emily was stunned. "What mistakes, Dad? What did she do?" David's eyes filled with sadness, and he slowly sat back down at the table. "I never wanted you to know this, but your grandmother wasn't just a loving mother and grandmother. There was a time when she made choices that hurt people. And Edward, well, he was a part of that. But it's over now. It happened years ago, and it was something your grandmother never wanted to talk about. She carried that guilt with her for the rest of her life." Emily felt like the world was spinning around her. Everything she thought she knew about her grandmother was crumbling. Her grandmother, the woman who had always seemed so kind and strong, had a dark secret, a secret that had shaped her entire life. But why had her father never told her the truth? David looked at Emily, his face filled with regret. "I didn't want you to be burdened with this. You were too young, and your grandmother wanted to protect you from it. But now, you deserve to know the truth. It's something that has haunted our family for years." Emily's mind was racing. What had Grandma done? And how had it affected her family? The answers were out there, and now, more than ever, Emily was determined to find them. She had come this far, and there was no turning back. The truth, no matter how painful, had to come out. The past couldn't stay buried forever. The truth had hit Emily like a heavy stone. What her father had just told her about her grandmother's past was more than she could handle. She had always seen Grandma as a kind, loving woman who cared for her family and did everything she could to protect them. But now, Emily saw her grandmother in a completely different light. The secrets, the mistakes. How could someone so close to her have kept something so big hidden? As the days passed, Emily couldn't stop thinking about it. She felt like she was walking through a fog, unable to see clearly. The weight of the secret seemed to grow heavier with every passing hour, and she couldn't shake the image of the man in the photograph, the man who had somehow been tied to Grandma's past. Who was he really? What had happened between them? Emily knew she had to dig deeper, but she felt scared. She wasn't sure what else she might uncover. One evening, as she sat in the living room with her father, she saw the same sadness in his eyes, the sadness that had been there ever since the funeral. She had never seen him like this before. David had always been the strong one, the one who could handle anything, but now he seemed broken. Emily watched him carefully, sensing that he was about to break down, just like she had. "Dad," Emily said quietly, her voice trembling. "What happened with Grandma and Edward? What really went on between them?" David didn't answer right away. Instead, he placed his hands on the table, looking down at them, as if trying to find the right words. Emily could feel the pain in the air, a pain that had been buried for years and was now bubbling to the surface. Finally, David spoke, his voice low and heavy. "I've never told anyone this, but it's time you knew. When your grandmother was young, she had a relationship with Edward, but it wasn't a good one. He wasn't a good man, Emily. He took advantage of her, used her trust and love for his own selfish reasons. She was young and confused, and she made choices that she regretted for the rest of her life." Emily's heart sank as she listened. It was hard to believe that her grandmother had been so vulnerable. The woman who had always been the rock of their family, the woman who seemed so strong, had been hurt in ways Emily couldn't fully understand. She wanted to ask more questions, but she could see the pain on her father's face. He was reliving the past, and it was too much for him. David continued, his voice thick with emotion. "When Edward's actions came to light, it destroyed her. She thought she could hide it, forget it, but she never could. It ate away at her, and it changed her. She tried so hard to move on, but she never truly forgave herself. That's why she kept everything hidden. She didn't want anyone to know the truth. She didn't want you or your mother to ever see her that way." Emily sat in stunned silence. She had never imagined something like this could happen. She always thought of her grandmother as perfect, as someone who had it all together. But now she realized Grandma had been carrying a heavy burden all these years, one that no one else had known about. David reached out and gently placed his hand on Emily's. "I never wanted you to know, Emily. I wanted to protect you from all of this. I didn't want you to see your grandmother as anything less than the woman you loved. But now, you need to understand that sometimes people make mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes are bigger than they realize." Tears filled Emily's eyes as she looked at her father. She had always seen him as the one who had all the answers, the one who knew how to make everything okay. But now she realized that even he had been broken by the past. They both were. David stood up and walked toward the window, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Emily sat quietly, trying to process everything. She had learned the truth, but it felt like her world had been turned upside down. The secret, the lies, everything felt different now. But she couldn't ignore the pain in her father's eyes. She needed to find a way to help him, just as he had always helped her. As the night grew darker, Emily made a promise to herself. No matter how hard it was, she would face the truth. She would not let it destroy her family. She would find a way to heal, and to help her father heal too. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only way forward. The truth was out, and now they had to live with it, together. The days after Emily's conversation with her father felt like they stretched on forever. The weight of their family's secret hung heavy in the air, and though Emily tried to continue with her life, nothing felt the same. Her father had told her the truth about Grandma's past, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. The knowledge that someone she loved so much had hidden such a deep, painful secret left Emily feeling lost. She didn't know what to do with all the emotions swirling inside her. David seemed to be in a similar state of confusion. He was going through the motions, getting up for work, making dinner, and trying to keep things normal. But Emily could see how much the truth had affected him. He wasn't the same person anymore. The strength he had once shown seemed to have faded, replaced by a quiet sadness that seemed to weigh him down. One evening, after a particularly long and silent dinner, Emily's father sat at the table, his hands resting on his lap. He stared at the empty plates, his mind clearly elsewhere. Emily could see the storm of emotions in his eyes: guilt, sorrow, regret. But she could also see that he was struggling to handle it all. She had never seen her father look so lost. "Dad," Emily asked, her voice soft, "are you okay?" David didn't answer right away. Instead, he wiped his hand over his face, as though trying to clear away the thoughts clouding his mind. "I don't know, Emily," he said finally, his voice shaky. "I just don't know how to deal with all of this. The past, it keeps coming back, and I'm not sure I can handle it." Emily's heart ached as she watched him. She knew he was trying to be strong for her, but she could see that the burden of the past was too much for him to carry alone. The weight of Grandma's secrets had broken something inside him, and Emily realized that he couldn't keep pretending everything was okay. "I think you need help, Dad," Emily said quietly. "I think we both do." David looked up at her, his eyes filled with surprise. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I think you need to talk to someone," Emily continued. "Someone who can help you understand all of this. We can't do this alone. The truth, it's too big for us to carry by ourselves." David stared at her for a long time, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded slowly, as though realizing for the first time that she was right. "You're right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been holding it all in for so long. I didn't want to burden you with it, but maybe I need help." Emily could feel the relief in her father's voice, and for the first time in a long while, she saw a small glimmer of hope in his eyes. They couldn't change the past, but maybe they could learn to live with it. Together. David reached for his phone and dialed a number. Emily didn't know who he was calling, but she could tell it was a step toward healing. It was a small thing, but it was the first step. "I'm going to talk to someone," David said, looking at Emily with a weak smile. "It's time." Emily nodded, feeling a sense of calm settle over her. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in weeks, she felt like they were on the right path. The truth had been hard to face, but it had opened the door to healing. As David spoke quietly into the phone, Emily glanced out the window at the darkening sky. She didn't have all the answers yet, and the pain of the past still lingered, but she knew one thing for sure. They were going to get through it. Together. The phone call ended, and David turned to Emily, his face softer now. "We'll get through this," he said, his voice more certain than before. "It's going to take time, but we'll figure it out. One step at a time." Emily smiled, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. She wasn't alone anymore, and neither was her father. Together, they would face the past, take the first steps toward healing, and begin to rebuild their family, piece by piece. The truth had come out, and now it was time to heal.